Okay, Emmanuel Levinas, part 2. Okay, so let's review, right? Because we did a lot last time, and let's remember what is the issue at hand that Levinas is trying to resolve, right? Remember, this is a class on if God exists, why do we go through so much, right? How can a loving God allow all these things to happen in the world? And here we are in post-Holocaust philosophy, where this is the question, right? The central question after the Holocaust was, where was God, right? If there is a God, right, where was he? Or who is he, right? These are the two questions. Was there a God? And if there is a God, who is he? Because we don't recognize him, right? We don't recognize the loving God who intervenes in history in this context. And if he is the loving God, where was he? Right? What's happening? Okay, so this is exactly the question that Levinas is trying to address. And last time we saw mostly the notion, very interesting idea, that the access to God, right, after the Holocaust cannot be anymore the access of certainty. I know who God is, I know this about him, I know these attributes about God, and I know that he wants this from me, right? We are no more clear as to who God is, right? And Levinas, and this is, I think, a master move, right? A masterful move. He says, yes, we are not clear anymore, and this is good, right? Let me say that again, right? He's saying, yes, we are not clear anymore as to who God is. We don't see clearly, is he loving? Is he really omnipotent? Is he really loving? Who is he? What's happening? The fact that everything has become confusing and unclear, Levinas is going to flip it, and he's going to say, this is a good thing. Why? Because if it was clear, it wouldn't be God. It would be idolatry. The fact, and he's saying, right, it is important to never reach full clarity when it comes to God. Doubt, questions, confusion are one of the spiritual paths to God. And in fact, for Levinas, is the royal road to God, right? So let me say it again. Doubts, questions, confusion about who God is actually the royal road to God, because at that moment you are in the stance of what Levinas calls the atheist, right? And for him, this is the most noble position, because at that moment, what he means by atheist is more what I mean by agnostic, right? The agnostic position for Levinas is the most noble, because you are really in a position where you don't know, and therefore you can receive a revelation. You are not never going to fall into idolatry, right? You are always going to be open to new revelations, new epiphanies, new knowledge of God. So that's where we left off, right? Okay. And by the way, I hope you saw the connections with Maimonides, right? I don't know if we didn't study this together, but I think I mentioned it last time. For Maimonides, there are levels of humanity, I guess, right? There's the lowest and the highest. What's the lowest? Let's review. For Maimonides, who's the lowest kind of person?
Blind faith.
No, even lower. There's lower. Think of the person the most remote from God. Who would that be? Y'all don't remember? Okay. Yes?
Somebody that doubts religion and that doubts logic.
Yes, exactly. Somebody who is a pagan over there, out there, right? Who doesn't know anything and who is ignorant, right? Then it gets better. Then you have the pagan who questions. Ah, that's better. Beneath the pagan who questions, you have the believer who has blind faith, right? So first you have the pagan, then you have believer with blind faith, which is very close to the pagan for Maimonides. Why? Because idolatry is thinks they know but don't know. Then you have the pagan who questions. Ah, that's where Levinas is. And then you have the believer who questions. Ah, that's the climax, right? So Levinas is at the level of the pagan who questions. He says, yeah, the agnostic stance is the most, is the best positioning possible towards the God he is, trying to articulate here for us. Okay, so of course now we have to ask ourselves, such a God which is nebulous, we don't know, we are confused, what kind of relationship is possible with such a God, right? Is there even a way to relate to this hidden God, right? To this ecliptic God. Can we actually relate to such a God? And for Levinas, we saw, right, that Levinas is going to forfeit, leave behind, cut off the relationship with a vertical God, right? Remember, Levinas, when, for the sake of the victims, chooses not to mend the relationship, right? He chooses not to pursue or rather to receive the invitation, right? He moves away from that. So for Levinas, after the war, it's impossible to have a vertical relationship, right? And so we have to find God in other places, right? For Levinas, God is no more in the heavens, ruling the world. All of this is false for Levinas. This is complete projection. He would agree with Nietzsche here, right? We have projected this. This is clearly not true. There is no God seated on a throne, waiting to save us. This is a complete delusion. This is a mass collective delusion. We need to move away from that. So, of course, the question is, where is God now? And what's interesting is that Levinas is going to find God, but in strange places. Okay, let me say that again. Levinas now is going to find God, but in strange places. And he's going to start by saying, we cannot find God directly, but we can find in the world traces of God, right? The footprint of God, indications, glimpses of God. And there's one particular place we can find this trace of God. And did anyone figure out where that is? Who is it in the universe that carries the trace of God, or who carries the glimpse of God? Exactly, right? Human beings, right? All of us, in a way, we contain the trace of God. Let's explain quickly what is a trace, right? So suppose you're at the beach and you're walking, right? And then you go home. Someone else comes later and they see your footprints. Are you there or are you not there? Remember, God is both present and absent. The footprint, does it mean you are there? Are you there with the footprint?
Oh, no. The footprint means that you were there.
Right, you're kind of there, but you're also not there, right? That's a trace, right? So in other words, in us, Levinas is saying, God is both here and not here. God is, he uses the word, it's interesting, in French it sounds nicer, in English it's awful. He says, in French it's beautiful, it says scintiller. Doesn't that sound nice? In English it's flashing, okay? So it's very beautiful in French, so it's poetic, scintiller, right? And then, but it means to flash. So God is flashing within us. It just doesn't work in English. So we have like the candle light, right? When the flickering, God is flickering. That's a good word, right? God is like a candle light flickering within us, on, off, on, off, on, off. Okay, so now of course you should be asking yourselves, I don't see that. Like I don't see, right? Certain people, especially that we hate. I don't see no flickering of God, right? They look, downright, horrible and hateful, right? So how does Levinas argue for this, right? Because we can just say, well, no, all you're seeing, we're just animals like the rest. Why are we special? Why is God flickering in us? Why is the trace of God? How do you prove this, right? Because we can just respond to Levinas, well, I don't believe you, right? We're just sophisticated animals with a good brain, and we can make tools. That's it. There's nothing more to us than a good, heavy brain and the ability to make tools, develop frontal cortex, whatever, right? So Levinas needs to make an argument for the fact that we carry this divine spark, right, or this flickering of the divine presence. He needs to make an argument, and that's what we're going to do right now, right? And then we'll draw the conclusions from that. Okay, so please write down, right, that next part that we're going to talk about is the argument for the fact that God is found within us, right? So he's moving God from the heavens into the earth. That's what Levinas is doing. God is no more seated on a throne. He is flickering feebly within humanity, right? Repercussions means you kill humanity, you kill God, right? Those are the repercussions. And we'll come to that. We'll talk about that, right? You save humanity, you save God, right? We're going to talk about this. So there are incredible implications. But first, let's go through, there's two arguments that Levinas gives to argue for the fact that the trace of God is within us, that we're not just sophisticated animals who make tools, right? Number one, we're going to talk about the argument from torture. And number two, the argument from compassion. These are not in the text we studied today. I'm drawing them from other texts, but they're necessary to understand his argument, right? Okay, argument, and you've done this, I think you know it from the other class. Good. Argument from torture. Let's talk about torture a little bit. Remember, these are two experiences that Levinas certainly had or witnessed because he was in the camps, he was in a war situation, so he has witnessed or experienced this. So let's talk about torture. I know we say torture is about getting information, but really it isn't, right? If you want information, you can ask for it. How many of you watched Homeland? Long time ago. You notice they never torture. They coax. You cannot torture information out of someone. We know this doesn't work. This is a pseudo argument so we can have the license to torture. The real torture is coming from a place of sadistic place, right? The person who tortures enjoys the torture, trying to get something more than information. What do you think someone who loves to torture, who loves to really inflict pain over, not kill, but inflict pain, what are they after really? I mean, I'm talking about those who relish this and who will do this even if there's no information anymore.
Suffering.
So they love suffering, but what are they, and why do they keep on doing it? What are they trying to destroy? Yes.
About power.
Yes, very good. Torture ultimately, thank you. Is that what you were going to say? Yeah. Torture ultimately is about power. Of course, you can enjoy the pain of the other. You can be, sick like that. But ultimately, it's about power, right? And you're trying to get to something that even if you kill the person, you wouldn't get it. And what the torturer is going to realize as they're torturing that person is that there is always something which will escape them. And that is what drives them crazy at times, right? You see at some point, I'm sure you've seen it in movies, right? The torturer just goes crazy, right? And just almost kills the person, has to be pulled back. No, why? Because they're sensing there's that thing I cannot destroy and I cannot have power over, and it drives them crazy. And so they become frenetic to the point of killing the person because they cannot reach that. So what you realize when you're witnessing torture or when you're undergoing it is that there is always something that will escape the torturer. Even false confessions, right? Even if it feels the person succumbed and wrote a false confession, right? Still there is something there that remains out of the reach of the torturer. And even if the torturer kills that person, something was not vanquished. Do you follow? And you know it yourself. If someone tortured you, right, you know there would always be that part of you which is resisting, right? Even if you write your false confession, part of you is resisting this. And that part of you which is resisting is the part that the torturer has not been able to control. Torture is about total control, which is impossible. Why, says Levinas? Because there is a part in us that cannot be controlled, that cannot be coerced, that cannot be brought under the power of a human being. That part of us he calls the trace of God, right? That's the part of us which humanity has no power over, right? The part of us that no one has power over. The part of us which is, what's the word? There's a word that's floating. Can't find
Suspended.
it. Huh?
Suspended.
Something like that. I mean, the word is floating, not the word. Yeah, there's a part of us which is out of reach, in a way which is holy, right? Out of reach, separate, distinct. That's what he calls the spark of God or the glimpse of God. Yes?
Is he just referring to the soul?
You could say that, right? So he doesn't talk about the soul because it's like more of a religious concept, but he talks about the trace, right? He's trying to do philosophy. And yes, you could say that's the spirit of the human being or the soul, right? That cannot be vanquished. And this, he says, this is the divine spark within all of us, right? This is his first proof, right? So it's a proof based, it's a phenomenological proof, meaning it's a proof based on observation of a phenomena. I'm looking at this and I'm seeing that there is something here that the torturer cannot control. What is that? Right? He calls it the trace of God. Yes?
But I would argue that this isn't true. His statement isn't true, and it's found within himself. Because he goes, right, and if he says the spark of God is in him, right, correlating that to his belief in his existence with God, right, and his communication with God, then why would he, after the Holocaust, he shouldn't walk away, because that could never be broken. But yet he does, and thousands and thousands of people also walk away. So it can't be broken. I would argue that it could be broken.
Yes, the vertical connection with God can be broken, the God up there. But what he's saying is that God is not up there, he's within. That's what he's saying. It's not anymore me and God. God is over here, I'm here, and we're relating. He says, no, I'm breaking that. And then he realizes God is within, has always been within. That's basically what he's gone, his journey. Does that make sense?
I understand, but even the God within can be broken if nobody believes.
Oh, I
If
see what you're
that person
saying.
doesn't believe, the
Okay.
God within, and the God within is
Yes.
disappears and is broken, and people in the Holocaust that obviously happened. So I would argue that
yes,
he disproves himself through his own experiments.
That's a good question. Yes, he calls it God, but the phenomena itself doesn't need to be called God, right? It's this element of resistance, right? So he's saying everyone has this. Even if they despair, even if they give up and surrender, and write the false letter or whatever, there's still always in every human being something that resists. Everyone has this. It's a phenomenon, right? But then he says, well, this I will call. He names it the spark of God. But you don't have to be even aware of God to have it. You see what I mean? It's human thing, which Levinas says actually it's a divine thing. He calls it that. But every human has it whether they know God or not. You know what I'm saying? You can be, what Levinas is saying basically, which is, you're helping me develop this, is you can be connected to God without knowing it. That's what he's saying. You can be a complete atheist, not believe in God, not want to believe in God, and still you carry the spark of God. That's what he would say, right? So even if you don't believe in God, it's still there. Does that make sense? Yeah, good. Kind of like Maimonides, right? Said reason, everyone has it, whether you're an atheist, a pagan, whatever, we all have reason. And whether we believe in God or not, we will receive the divine light according to the quality of our vessel, right? So you can be a Hindu, right, with a big vessel, boom, divine providence will flow through you. You see what I'm saying? That's the crazy stuff Maimonides is really saying, which is not taught, right? So that's what he's saying. You don't have to know God to be inhabited by God. That's the idea. Now, any other questions? That's a good question. Any other questions on this argument from torture? Okay, same argument, or similar argument from compassion. So this is very famous situation, happened often. You're in the camp, everybody's a stranger to you, you don't know anyone. And there are many instances that he started to observe where the person, younger, right, feeding an elderly person who is not even related to them, giving them their bread that they need to survive, right? So he's noticing, so now it makes no sense, right? It's not related to you, it's not younger than you, they're gonna die, right? Why are you feeding this person, right? This is not utilitarian, it's bad. It's why would you increase this person's chances when they're about to die, they're old, and you want to survive, you're young, right? So he notices this absurd, makes no sense generosity, right? Generosity that makes no sense. It's not helping me. It's not helping the community. It's not instinctual. I have no connection to this person. Why are you doing this, right? And again, he's going to say, you are trying to help this person. Why? Because you're seeing something there in them, which is, in a way, compelling you to do this, right? I mean, if you're giving your bread to someone you don't know, something compelled you to do it, right? You saw them, and something in their face compelled you to do it. That thing that you saw in their face, which compelled you to help them, is the trace of God. Does that make sense? So anytime we feel like we look at someone and whatever we see there moves us, sometimes person's not even talking. Sometimes they're just not even looking at us. And something there just stabs us in the heart and we feel deeply moved to respond. That thing we saw that the person did not even speak, that's the trace of God. Do you follow me? Right? You can walk down the street in Manhattan and see someone completely miserable on the street, right? They didn't even talk to you. And probably you'll walk by, right, with COVID and everything, right? But something in you was moved, certainly. I mean, immediately we become annoyed and irritated, and why are they there, and why is the government not helping, and, we get angry. But something before that, before you get pissed and resentful and annoyed, something was moved. There was an imperative. This shouldn't be happening. Why is this person there? That thing in you where you're sensing the imperative of them not being like this on the street. You are seeing, you're not even seeing them. They're wearing a hoodie. You don't even see their face. But you're seeing in that huddled person this imperative, that shouldn't be. You're witnessing the trace of God. Are you following? Right? Anytime you're moved by another human being to act imperatively on their behalf, whether you do it or not, you have seen at that moment the trace of God, right? So you can see how God has shifted from the heavens to the earth, from the heights to the lows, right? God is no more in the heights, in the clouds, on a throne. God is sitting there huddled in a hoodie on the street without looking at you, right? God is there in the low places of the earth rather than in the high places of the earth. You want to find God? Don't look up, look down. That's what Levinas is saying, right? Any questions on that second argument before we draw the implications? Yes?
What about the other side? What about Levi's hatred or unfounded violence?
Yeah, this is the inability, right, to see the trace of God. So it doesn't mean trace of God doesn't mean you're going to see it.
Levinas, everybody has it, so how could they?
Oh yeah, everybody has it, but not everyone responds to it the same way, right? So I can see you all huddled and kick you because I'm a jerk like that, right? So, but I think it's like he would argue that even the worst criminal, right, will have moments of compassion. There's a famous story about I think it's a story about Genghis Khan. You know Genghis Khan from the movies? Very, very horrific, cruel, right, barbaric, whatever. I don't know how they depict him there, but in history, he's depicted as one of the most cruel, right, warriors in time. And there's a very famous story that he ended up in hell, right, and really he had, killed everybody. There was no mercy. He was really at the bottom of hell. And one day, a spider arrives and starts just in front of him, a little spider. And the spider begins to weave, do you know the story? A string, which goes to the top of the roof of hell. And this string becomes thicker and thicker, becomes a rope. And Genghis Khan is realizing, I can climb this and get out of hell, right? And so the spider is actually trying to help him. Why is that? We know from the backstory. There was one time he was in a forest, this Genghis Khan with his hordes, right? And there was a spider on the ground, and instead of stepping on it, he kind of moved around it, right? Had a moment of compassion for the spider. And so the spider comes back, right, and builds a way out. So he's climbing, and as he's climbing, all the people of hell see him climbing, and they want to climb too. So here they are following him, and then he gets annoyed. He's like, yo, you're going to break my spider thing. There's going to be too many of you on here. So he starts to kick him off, and as he kicks him off, he breaks himself. The thread of the spider falls back in the bottom of hell and dies there, right? Sad story. But just all this to tell you that moment with the spider, even the most hardened criminal, right, has moments where they're moved to compassion. At that moment, they are witnessing, right, the trace of God, right? And in this case, it was in a spider, which Levinas would never say, right? But you could say that. So yeah, so the trace of God, that you see it or not, of course, it depends. This is interesting what you're saying, Epstein, because the trace of God, if you don't see it, it dies, right? If you don't respond to it, it just disappears in the huddle, right? So what the implications are enormous. Two things come out of this. Number one, new perspective on God. Like, we have to get rid of this idea that God is this omnipotent, omniscient, all-loving, all-powerful, right? God that is going to save us. Levinas saying this is a delusion. God is still with us, but he is found in the low parts of the earth. You want to find God? Reach out to those. Respond to the trace, right? Offer your help to the huddled person in the hoodie, and at that moment, you will be finding yourself in the very presence of God, right? So that's the first thing we learn, right? We need to see God differently if we're going to survive the Holocaust, right? Conceptually, at least, right? Or spiritually. The second thing we realize, right, is that in a way, if we don't respond to the trace of God in the people around us, right? If we don't honor that presence, if we don't protect humanity, right, from death, from suffering, from abuse, The trace of God itself is in danger, and God himself is in danger of disappearing. In other words, the very existence of God depends on how we treat each other. The moment humanity begins to enter the dark night of genocide, of massacres, of rape, of violence, God himself is in danger. The presence of God, rather, among us is in danger, right? Each time we kill a human being, we take away a little bit of the divine presence out of this world. That's what he is saying. In other words, the presence of God in this world depends on how we protect it within the body temple, right, of humanity. The moment we start to destroy humanity is the moment we will wipe the presence of God from the earth, right? Does that make sense? So very, very powerful implications. Let's see. Yeah. And now we are in a position to answer the question, where was God during the Holocaust, right? So what would be, and this is also a test question. So what would be your answer? Now that you know what you know, what would be the answer to where was God during the Holocaust? Yes?
It was in the people that were being destroyed.
Okay, very good. So right, God was in the people who were being destroyed, right? He was not up there allowing things. He was down there with the victim, right? God was the victim in a way, right? And we, in a way, have not protected him. We have not comforted him. We have not shielded him from the darkness that was pushing into Europe at the time. See, did you want to add a...
Oh, no, I was asking the same question.
Okay, very good, right? So we'll see that Simone Weil, it's going to be, I'll just anticipating, right? She's going to say the opposite. We're going to study this on Zoom, right, or through the videos. She's going to say, where was God? God was in those who helped, right? Very more Christian approach, right? So where was God? She would ask, where were you? Right? That would be the way. So you can see how both, in a way, are bringing God down to the human level. Levinas, God is in the victim. Simone Weil, God is in those who help the victims, right? And if you're not helping, there is no God, right? For Simone Weil, we'll see that we are the hands and feet of God. It's a very Christian idea, right? We are the body of God, basically, is the idea in Christianity. And if we do not act, there is no God, right? So you can see how both are making the same move, right? Yes.
Just wanted to share this idea that you mentioned, that you explained Levinas, that God is with the victims. It just reminded me of something that said in the book of Psalms, it was Emo Anochi B'tzara, which means I am with them in their suffering.
Yes, absolutely. It's a very Jewish thing. Yeah, absolutely. We know the very famous story. I must have told you this. Did I tell you the story about the lepers of Jerusalem? Yes, same idea, right? Where will the Messiah be when he arrives, right? Messiah, which is this, this kind of redeemer in the Jewish tradition, almost a divine figure, right? Where will he be when at the end of times? Will he be on the throne? Will he be in the temple? No, he will be outside the walls of Jerusalem among the lepers. Lepers is people who are suffering from this terrible disease that eats up your flesh and bones. He will be there binding their wounds, right? So interesting, right? This idea that God is in the victim. So we go back to this image, right, that I mentioned in the introductory video with Elie Wiesel, right, who was watching these three people being hung in Auschwitz, right? So you had the two adults and the child was not dying, if you recall, and someone behind is asking, where is God? And Elie Wiesel, in a moment, in a flash of intuition, God is here in this dying child. This is what Levinas is saying. The moment God is in the victim, God is in those who are dying. And to connect to God is to connect to those people. And to believe in God is to protect humanity. If you want to maintain the presence of God in the world, protect humanity, because humanity is the vessel of God. That's the idea. You destroy the vessel, no more God, right? Let me say it again, right? To protect the presence of God in the world, if you want to nurture, cultivate this presence in the world, you have to protect the vessel which contains this presence, the earthen clay vessel which contains this presence. You have to protect humanity. If we protect humanity, we protect God. In a world where humanity is no more sacred, there is no more God, right? This is the idea here. Excellent.
But
yes.
What are the implications then for the omnipotence of God?
This is a
That's
false.
how we started off.
False concept for Levinas. God is weak, right? Write this down. It's beautiful. God is weak, right? God is not strong. God is weak. I was so struck. There's a friend of mine who is Orthodox, Christian Orthodox, and they're very different, right? Orthodox Christianity is very different from Western Christianity. And she once told me something which really I had never heard before. She told me God is humble. I was like, what? That I never figured that God, right? God always seemed a little arrogant to me, right? Coming, looking big and loud, right? I mean, we see the God in Job, right? The book of Job is a very, very macho God, right? So the idea that God is humble, right, was very powerful for me. This is the idea, right? Levinas is saying this, saying God is humble, God is poor, God is persecuted, and God is weak. The idea we had of God is omnipotent, passé. Yes.
I think it's interesting. There's this transition in Jewish thought historically from God being this powerful, aggressive, like assertive, dominant being to becoming something that's called in Jewish text Shkhinta Begaluta. It's the divine presence in exile.
Ah, yes, very
That's
good.
a concept in Jewish mysticism.
Yes.
And so it's interesting how that progressed.
Absolutely, right? And connections between Judaism and Christianity, whether they like it or not, right? This idea of the persecuted God is one of the central ideas of Christianity, right? God is the suffering one, the persecuted one. So they're kind of meeting, right? It's very strange that at the end of a long journey of hate and resentment, they meet without knowing on this, with Levinas, of course, right? He's the one kind of bringing these two traditions together. They're saying the same thing in the end, right? It's very interesting, to me at least. Okay, great. Any other points on C? Go ahead.
I would argue that, like, the idea that God is omnipotent isn't completely destroyed by this concept, because I feel that God, with this idea can do harm, but if we operate off the notion that God, or not God, but there is some goodness in the world, no matter what, then you can't kill God completely. And I think for some people, the definition of omnipotence is that you're immortal.
Yes, I like that, right? As long as there's human beings, you have God. You can go beyond. As long as there's nature, right? If you want to go that, Levinas would never go there, right? But some of us, right, like to see nature as having this kind of trace of God, right? The Greeks believe that, right? If you go to any of the Eastern religions, they believe nature has the trace of God, right? So yes, as long as there's like some beautiful sunset, right? As long as we're not living in a dungeon, all of us, right? Eating, whatever astronaut food because we cannot grow anything and the sun has died, there is a God, right? You can say that. So as long as, some people would argue, as long as there's nature, as long as there's human beings walking around. But the moment there is no more human beings, the moment we get to the point of the Walking Dead, right? It's over. Do you see God in The Walking Dead? I don't. Right there, it's a very uncomfortable show for me, right? Because it really is. Like, I can't bear it because precisely that. I don't see a single spark, right, of humanity in some of these shows, right? So the day we get to The Walking Dead or to The Purge, right, no more God. Does that make sense? See? Right? God is found in humanity. When humanity doesn't exist, or when it has been in a way distorted to become like The Walking Dead, is over. Right? God can go to, well, of course, you could argue God endures, but not here. Right? Not around. He's not around anymore. Right? Excellent. So, any other comments before we, yes, go ahead, Michel.
So, I understand that Levinas is like rejecting the idea that God is defined, but then like I feel like he just redefines it. And so like how is this
Yes.
not like idolatry or like the exact same thing that he was going against?
It's not idolatry because it's a trace, meaning he's not sure, right? Like all of these philosophers, like Marcel that we studied, he's saying, it seems to me that this can be interpreted as the trace of God. But of course, he's not going to say, it's the trace of God. You will die, right? He's not going around forcing you to believe anything, right? He's saying, I'm seeing something here, which for me resembles the trace of God, right? But again, nothing he's saying, right, is something that he can prove. Can't prove that. He's just saying this is one way of seeing it, right? The other way we can see it is like, oh, it's just, we're just intelligent, right? And we can make tools. That's, and there's nothing really resisting, and compassion is instinctive because deep down we know we have to continue as a race. You know how people make those arguments, right? There's always that person in the classroom gonna say, oh, but it's still about survival, right? Blah, blah, blah. But why? Why should we survive? I would argue, right? Because there is something valuable that we are sensing in our species, right? So,
Because we fear death.
and that too, yes, absolutely. But here in this case, you are risking death to help that person, so it's a little different, right? So of course, yeah, Levinas is, you cannot be sure of anything that's happening. It's just he's unveiling a possibility. He is opening up a new horizon of thought, which you can totally refuse, right? Absolutely. And it's not idolatry also because it's the trace of God which you also cannot define. I cannot get to this thing that is resisting, or I can't tell exactly what told me to do this, right? It's still very, right? It escapes me. And yet it's there pushing me to help, right? So there is no image or fixed, right? It's something that I'm sensing, and I cannot even be sure that this is God or not, right? Very good. Now, anything else before? Okay, quick response to Nietzsche, right? We're responding to Nietzsche. Are we responding to Nietzsche in the test? No, right? I'm just going to respond me to Nietzsche. So I love to respond to Nietzsche. You can see how Levinas has Nietzsche in the back of his head, right, as he's talking. Right? Remember how Nietzsche said religion is all about comfort. It's about because we feel so miserable, and so we create this alternative reality so we can feel comfortable in life. And here with Levinas, we're seeing something else. Religion is not comfort. True religion is discomfort. Okay, you can write this down. This is interesting, right? Instead of religion or true spirituality being about comfort, it's about discomfort. You are truly spiritual to the degree that you are uncomfortable in the world as it is. Let me say that again. You're truly spiritual to the degree that you are uncomfortable in the world as it is. If you're comfortable, there's something wrong with you. If you're comfortable with all the war, the destruction, the rape, the violation, the pillage, right, that is going on a daily basis, you're not, right, you're not truly spiritual, he's saying. You're not able to connect to the rest of humanity, and therefore you're missing God, right? So that's interesting twist. And then, of course, follow up on that. Religion, therefore, is not escape, right? Which is what Nietzsche was saying. Religion is an escape. It's a hypersensitivity to the reality around you, right? Rather than being an escape out of reality, for Levinas, true spirituality is a hypersensibility, hyper-awareness of the reality around you. You are inhabiting it so powerfully that you are uncomfortable, right? You're not leaving the world. You're constantly pulled back into the world by spirituality, right? What makes you spiritual is, I cannot sit in front of Netflix without thinking of what I just saw in the street, right? You're constantly pulled back by reality. That's what makes for a truly spiritual person, right? So it's interesting, right? This is the way that he would, in my view, respond to Nietzsche. And I think Nietzsche would be intrigued, at least, with this reasoning. Okay, great. We're exactly on time. It's wonderful. So goodbye, everybody. I'm going to close the recording.